if you're a skeptic, you have to answer to me how it is that prophecy has been fulfilled so regularly throughout the Bible. Because, prophecy is how us Christians, that's terminology that we Christians use. For the atheist or the skeptic, let's call it predictions, okay? And prophecy goes more than just predicting, but for the sake of the skeptic, prophecies are written about in the Old Testament hundreds of years before they happened, and then they came true with 100% consistency. There's not one single prophecy, prediction, ever written in the Bible that the window of opportunity has closed up and passed for that to come true.
I would like to bring this up with the panel for the Blasphemers Bible series. I'm thinking of a handful of prophecies that did not come true. I'm like, Ezekiel is a great example. Isaiah presents a couple more. Like the existence or continued existence of Tyre, which, by the way, is still mentioned in the Bible. Even the Bible is aware that Tyre still exists after Ezekiel's prophecy failed. And Ezekiel seems to be aware of that himself when he made a similar prophecy about the destruction of Egypt, again by the same king. I forget who the king was going to be, but it was supposed to take over, destroy not only Tyre, leaving there nothing remaining but a bare rock in the midst of the waters that no one would recognize as Tyre. No one would be able to find it. That was what the Bible was saying. And then he said similarly that Egypt, under the same king, would be desolate, so widely desolate that not man nor beast would set foot anywhere in Egypt for 40 years. And these were all supposed to be while this one king was alive. He's dead now, and neither of those things ever happened. So there's a prophecy that utterly failed. What do the rest of you have to say?
There are a few more. The ones that spring to mind would be, of course, we actually just covered it on Blasphemers Bible in 2 Samuel 7, the dynastic promise to David that his seed would be on the throne of Israel forever. That obviously can't be true because there was a time where it was not. So already that's false. And another one would be in the New Testament where, I know this is not, his point, right? But if he's talking about the whole Bible having prophetic claims that have never not come true, when Jesus says that, not a single person of this generation will pass away. The thing is, he was there. Everything about the Greeks suggests that it is, in fact, that generation. Nothing, there's nothing special. There's no funky wordplay you can do. It is talking specifically about that group of people that were alive then. That's
the ones that he was speaking to. Yes. Yeah. And it's
so
interesting.
Already those are two that are false.
That phrase, actually, this generation shall not pass away, has led to innumerable small cults and groups breaking off and trying to interpret who might have been meant by this generation. Because the assumption is, of course, that Jesus cannot be wrong. Therefore, he didn't mean what he said. He meant something else. And, the great disappointment of, 1897, 93, I can't recall, where the apocalypse was predicted and everyone went and stood on top of their home for some reason and waited to be raptured and then weren't. And the shake off from that, the Seventh-day Adventists using that math, the Jehovah's Witnesses using that math to this day. And they've had to concoct some strange overlapping generation to account for the fact that they moved to the date to 1914, and then it's been over 100 years and Jesus is still is suspiciously absent in all of that. And in even common Christianity, the prophecy about Tyre particularly, I remember being told many times that the location of Tyre where it is right now is not the original location, that the original location was indeed abandoned and blah, 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 blah. If you know anything about the history of Tyre, even the most passing amount, you know that it has a very interesting history with using the sea as a defense, being alternatively an island and a peninsula with, setting this out with stakes in the water so you could, only people who knew how to get in could sail their ships safely and so on and so forth. You can go on Google Maps right now. You can look at the shape of the landmass of where Tyre is right now. You can see it's that built out peninsula that it has always been, based on those ancient defenses of ancient ships and the sea. It's a lie because we can't be wrong. And this is something that comes up so often in conversations about Christian prophecy and the justifications of it that honestly, I think the entire thing can be debunked just by reading the various things that Christians have claimed to be fulfilled prophecies anytime in the last 2,000 years.
Well, I think we're going to have an opportunity to do that right now on this show.
Everything that is capable of having come true by that time with 100% consistency has. And about Jesus himself, there's over 100 predictions about the coming Messiah.
But as Lilith just pointed out, Jesus failed his own prophecy when he said, some of you, not all of you, but some of you standing here now will not taste of death before they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of the right hand of power and all that shit. Because he told a handful of people mildly different versions of that you will see me coming in the clouds at the right hand of power and all that. So they can't be talking about the transfiguration a week later. We're not talking about a week later when nobody died. We're talking about sometime a little further down when some, but not all of these people died. So one of the other excuses that I've heard for this is that they died in the body, but they didn't die in the spirit. So that's why no, that's clearly not what Jesus was talking about. Lawrence, would you agree with that?
I mean, the from what I remember from last time I looked it up and did like an actual analysis. No, it said that it implied a very much real death.
And
so
important for the people to know that Lawrence can read Koine Greek, so he's our Greek scholar here.
I'm something like that. I'm still practicing. There's a
you're the closest expertise that we have in this. You are studying in this. You learned ancient Greek, not just Koine, but what was the other one?
Yeah. I mean, ancient Greek is a very vague term, right? So like okay. So most of my time I concentrate on Koine and Attic, but like I also, because I study the Septuagint once in a while, I have to learn like a Hellenized Greek, but there's a Hellenic period Greek, but in that I have also come across plenty of Doric variations, Ionic, the at least the major dialect groups. I've at least had to translate some of those works from each one.
Okay.
This is how you can tell.
So I just wanted to bring this up because it matters when we're discussing what is written in Greek and what specific context these words and these sentences mean. So, thank you for that, Lilith.
I was just going to say this is how you can tell that Lawrence actually knows what he's talking about, because he's eternally modest and actually qualifies how much he knows about the various forms of Greek, whereas the average person doesn't even know that there are so many variations of ancient Greek.
There are quite a lot of dialects.
Of course.
It gets more complicated once you get into like the smaller stuff, but at least the major dialectic groups, those are the ones I've at least been over.
When you first asked us to contribute on this, you sent us a list, or at least a partial list, of some of the prophecies that he was referring to as being referring to Jesus. And obviously we're going to go over all of these with a fine-tooth comb. But as I look through it, I look at these individual snippet verses chopped out of various places: Micah, Isaiah, Psalms, Zechariah, Ezekiel, Exodus, all over the place, individual bits and verses without any context. And it reminds me of a story I was told as a Christian to keep me from misinterpreting the Bible. The joke being about the woman who would find out what God was saying to her by opening her Bible, putting her finger down and reading it. And that was what God was telling her today. And the joke being that one day she opened the Bible and read, "And Judas went and hanged himself," and was confused. So she assumed it had to be a partial message, closed the Bible, opened it, put her finger down again, and landed on, "Go and do thou likewise." And This is a story that Christians would tell Christians to point out that you can misuse the Bible by snagging a bit here and a bit there, and and you can stitch it into anything you want. And that's not how an honest and intelligent person with any kind of character uses the Bible. And yet, that appears to be exactly what we did with the story of Jesus and the prophecies. And I just have to find some irony in that.
And even if you're an atheist, you don't want to believe the Bible's the Word of God, okay, fine. You still have to deal with the fact that hundreds of years before Jesus came in history, you had real human beings writing down predictions about what he's going to do.
We should also make mention of the fact that that where this preacher, Bob Dutko, he says that all these people that were writing the Bible, that they were all telling the same story. And now he's referencing how there's 100 predictions about what Jesus is going to do. However, from what I've seen some rabbinical sources that say, here's the things that the Messiah is supposed to do. One, he's supposed to be Jewish. Okay, Jesus got that one. He must be a member of the tribe of Judah and a direct male descendant of both King David and King Solomon. And we've got conflicting genealogies here, which call that into question for Jesus. And then 3, he must gather the Jewish people from exile and return them to Israel. When the fuck did Jesus ever do that? He must rebuild the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And he's supposed to do that before he dies, by the way, because he's not supposed to be able to die. We'll get to that in a moment. Jesus, as the Messiah during his lifetime 2,000 years ago, or excuse me, the Messiah during his lifetime, however long ago or whenever he comes up, he's supposed to bring world peace. Jesus kind of failed to do that. And he must influence the entire world to acknowledge and serve one God. And all of these criteria for the Messiah are supposed to have happened while the Messiah is alive.
Well,
and Jews for Judaism adds that if an individual fails to fulfill even one of these conditions, he cannot be the Messiah.
So that's a modern group, right?
Yeah.
So I would say, like, when we're looking at these texts, I mean, Lilith mentioned it earlier. We are taking Christians like to take so many things and misapply them, and like even just looking at like the list of stuff that what's his name, Bob, that he's going to cover.
I do like that, Bob.
Yeah, Bob. So the stuff that he is going to cover, the stuff that these prophecies reference, the vast majority of them were not even written as prophecies, and they were never meant to be prophecies. So, like, when it comes to, I mean, we'll get to it, but there's the suffering servant. There is the Psalms, right? Constantly talking about stuff in Psalms, and those, if Psalms were meant to be prophecies, they have an incredibly low hit rate. Let's get that incredibly clear. And most of the Psalms are, well, I'm not sure about most, but quite a lot of them, especially the ones that are referenced here, are like Psalms of lament. They are, the psalmist that is having some kind of personal issue. He has some enemies around, the wicked, right? Those are the main enemies of the book of Psalms. And he is lamenting his position, how he's being treated and stuff like this, but they are not talking about someone in the future that is going to be experiencing this. They're talking about that person experiencing it then.
And
traditionally,
I also,
it's supposed to be David. It's supposed to, traditionally,
yes.
it's David's first-hand experience.
Yeah.
Or I mean, obviously,
unlikely,
it's
but
not
that
from
is
him.
traditional. Yeah.
Unlikely, but like the psalmists later on would have, even if they, they're not pretending to be David, but they would have been like using that sort of him as a metaphor maybe for their own troubles. Going through exile and stuff like that. On the rivers of Babylon. That's obviously not David.
For example, it was prophesied hundreds of years before Jesus came along that the Messiah would be born specifically in Bethlehem.
I have to thank Isaac and Tomer here for gathering up all these references, because Bob Dutko did not mention, for all of the prophecies he's referring to, chapter or verse or what he's in fact referring to. So Isaac and Tomer both found all of these. So thank you. And the first one is Micah 5:2, which says, "But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah," I should have let Tomer read this, "who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me, one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient days." So
Yeah.
what's that
yeah.
really saying?
So this one, unlike stuff like Psalms, actually is a prophecy. It's written like a prophecy, right? So this one we can take as like an actual thing that they believed about the Messiah, right? So the Messiah being born and the so the Messiah being born in Bethlehem. Bethlehem, we talked about this on Blasphemous Bible, but there is that strong connection between Bethlehem of Judea and David, right? So that you can look at the links in Ruth or in First Chronicles, where the great grandmother of Bethlehem is Ephrathoth, and David is being listed as from Bethlehem. So it's interesting when it comes to Micah, because Micah, generally speaking, not all the time, there is argument over some verses here and there, but it's generally thought that only chapters 1 through 3 would have been the authentic portion of Micah. Although this section has been argued to have been originally part of that composition. The language does share similarities to Isaiah 40:11, which is in that same context of a later period, but there's still debate around it. So I want to make that clear. So this would have been written like around the end of the 8th century BCE, or maybe in the early 7th century. By the way, Hezekiah was the king of Jerusalem when the Assyrians invaded, and this section here. So in Micah 5:5-6, this Messiah, who is said to be the one to one day rule Israel, is going to be the ruler of the Assyrians too. So they are cherry picking this one part of this prophecy and applying it to Jesus. And I want to make this kind of clear here. So there were actually 2 Bethlehems, and this actually starts to confuse, at least if you want to look at it as one whole story. This would confuse any reader of the New Testament, because while Mark and Matthew are very clear that he's from Bethlehem of Judea, there's a very strange portion in John. So it's John 7:41-42. I think those are the verses. It kind of mentions that, like, should the prophet come from from the Galilee, and the Galilee is the region where that's where Nazareth is. It's further north than the Bethlehem of Judah, and near Bethlehem, like a few miles away from Nazareth in the Galilee, is the other town called Bethlehem. So at least according to the presupposition of John, he is from the Bethlehem of the Galilee, not from the Bethlehem of Judea, which is a fun little thing that I noted. But so there's one in the area of Ephrath, and the other is near Nazareth. The northern one is, of course, in the Galilee. And while all of them agree that they all show knowledge of one of a prophecy being that he would be born in Bethlehem. Although it has been argued that if Jesus, from what we can tell from the Gospels, it is just more likely that he was actually just born in Nazareth, because they try to make him a citizen of multiple places, that he was coming from multiple places, and it's
I
more
wondered
likely
about that.
that
He's had 3 childhoods.
Yeah, it's a rough
Bethlehem,
one. Yeah.
Nazareth, and somehow also Egypt.
But
Yeah,
none of
so
the events in Egypt are covered, and there's also a couple of trips to Jerusalem that
yeah.
contradict that. It's all a bit convoluted.
Yeah, so
There's
the idea here is that so Jesus himself would have likely been born in Nazareth because you're far more likely to change far more likely to change the Nazareth hometown into the Bethlehem one to make it match up with this prophecy. But but there's no reason to change it from actually Bethlehem to Nazareth. Uh, so it is more likely that Jesus would have been born in Nazareth.
Yeah, this is even an argument for historicism for Jesus, where we have a real life person who was known as a Nazarene. He was from Nazareth. And then, in order to make him fit with this biblical messianic figure, they're like, oh, here is a prophecy that we're going to understand to be about the Messiah. It says he comes from Bethlehem. How does he come from Bethlehem? But, oh, he's born in Bethlehem, but he lived in Nazareth later on. And so it's like a self-fulfilling.
It
No,
was
cut
segregation
out
and
there.
busing.
yes.
Although I do want to point out, I was able to. Maybe Tomer and Isaac already found these sources, but I was able to find a Talmudic source from the Jerusalem Talmud
Good.
about the Messiah being born and the temple being destroyed on the same day. So there's a story about a Jew who hears about the destruction of the temple and the birth of Messiah. So he's just like, tilling his land or whatever. And he hears that the Messiah is named Menahem and his father is Hezekiah. But then his mother wants to kill him because of the association with the temple destruction. He's like, oh my God, his birth has somehow caused the destruction of the temple. But the Jew in the story believes that the Messiah will, of course, restore the temple. And that, as you pointed out, was a belief that is listed for what was it, Jews for Judaism, right? But there was also this common belief that the Messiah was already born, but was like hidden away for a while. And this the story in full does also mention that near the end. And
I would just
that's from the Jerusalem Talmud, Barakot 2:4.
Thank you. I would just like to point out that this is actually one of the reasons why I tend to be more of a mythicist, light mythicist, nothing crazy. It's that when you talk to Christians about the prophecies they are trying to apply to Jesus, they will always insist that Jesus fulfilled these prophecies as we see in the stories. If you bring up even the possibility that the stories were scripted to selected prophecies, they will become enraged, despite the fact that, statistically speaking, just in our understanding of history and human culture and writing and how it works, that is far more probable. And the birth in Bethlehem is part of the nativity narratives, because there's not one narrative. If you go through the nativity in Matthew and Luke and compare them, and I encourage you to do so, there is not a single point of overlap that is not deliberately scripted to fulfill a prophecy that has been selected. Whether or not it was ever intended to be a prophecy of the Messiah, irrelevant. But there's no mundane overlap whatsoever. You have in Bethlehem overlap. You have born of a virgin, prophecy overlap. But nothing that happens, the stitched together story that we have with the travel and the shepherds, but then also the wise men, it's just a mishmash. If you look at the stories side by side, not a single point of overlap, aside from the names, which you pretty much have to even pretend it's the same story, has anything to do with the mundane. And if you look at that, yes, two different people talk about an experience, they'll talk about different attributes of it, but they will have some mundane overlap. And there's not a single point of it in this story. And that's why I consider it so much more infinitely probable that the stories were scripted to the presumed prophecies and not that the story accidentally fulfilled the prophecies.
I think every Jesus historicist that I've ever talked to would also agree that there's a lot that was embellished, that was added after the fact. I mean, the thing about Jesus and the adulteress, for example, I think that the scholarship commonly dismisses that wasn't a thing that really happened. That was something that was added later.
Yeah, I also have a video on that, by the way, how we know that.
It's too bad.
And
It's a good
then-
story, but
I think the issue with the fig tree might be another one.
Yeah, I think you can
That
probably throw
one-
out everything that happened before he was an adult, right? His followers would have known him as an adult from Nazareth, blah, blah, blah. But they wouldn't have known anything about his childhood. And so that would have all been free to develop later.
the fig tree is considered one of the better attested stories because it does appear in all of the, Matthew, Mark, Luke. But it doesn't make any sense as a historical event. It only makes sense as a parable. And given that Mark and those after him are always like, I speak in parables to the people, but I speak plainly to you. But parables, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, say them all. You get the idea that the deeper truth of replacing the temple cult with Jesus and whatnot being the underlying story of this is what the actual point of the story was. Not that Jesus actually had a rage fit because a tree didn't have fruit out of season and killed some innocent living thing and destroyed someone's property in a temper tantrum, because that's, not very godly.
Homer, do you
Micah.
have something to say about Micah 5:2?
Yeah, I have quite some, like not a whole lot. I mean, in general, this project, quote unquote, was a bit difficult for me. It was hard because I had such a short time, and it's very difficult, especially since there's no like structured literature when it comes to Jewish responses to Christians. Though maybe I'm a bit lazy when it comes to this, but I just tried to find whatever I could find when it comes to like medieval Jewish commentators or even modern ones. Sometimes the Talmud, but not a whole lot, and sometimes they don't really respond to these prophecies. They'll just text them, yeah, it's a prophecy about the Messiah, but. Yeah.
I can empathize with you because I mean this is the Hebrew Bible, and the Christians have come and appropriated everything in the Old Testament to make it to pretend as if it says something else. And so why would you have responses to the people who then came and revised your Bible?
So I
And also,
kind
it
of want
was
to make.
sometimes dangerous. It was sometimes dangerous to debate Christians in medieval times as well. So,
Oh yeah,
Oh,
sure.
yeah.
After a certain point, yeah.
like you can
Yeah,
probably look
because
up
they burned a
the.
lot of books and Jews as well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
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 I think there's a
Medieval
famous
times
debate.
and in Alabama.
There's a series of books. I think it's a 3-part series right now. So this is just the one that I have. It's called A Commentary on the New Testament from the Talmud and Midrash. So it's not. This is just Matthew, by the way. But the which is insane. But the thing is, the way this is set up is like it's not like direct responses to this necessarily, but like each verse, it, goes verse by verse, and it says like, well, here's like the Jewish background for these verses. Here's what rabbis were saying about these verses, and sometimes they do or do not actually reference Christians, but it's a big compilation of quotations from the Talmud and Midrash.
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to this verse in Micah 1, I mean, in the Hebrew Bible, it's Micah 1, but in the Old Testament, is verse 2. For whatever reason, like the instances where the Old Testament is not, the verses are not really in the structure of the Hebrew Bible. Never mind. So when it comes to this verse, so yeah, it is taken by most traditional commentators as the Messiah. But the origin of the Messiah's family, who is the son of David, is from Bethlehem, where David is born. That's one. And there is a specific comment from Rabbi David Kimchi, aka the Radak, about the claim that this refers to Jesus. And he writes, and this is my translation, and those who are in the wrong claim that this verse is about Jesus and say that he was born in Bethlehem and that this is a god because he was from ancient times. Yeah. There
In the
is a
previous episode of this series, Bob Dutko said that all of the 40 some odd authors of the 66 books were all writing a completely cohesive story. They were all writing the one same story about how Jews are going to be redeemed to God through Jesus.
I guess. So I'll continue. There is a refutation, for Jesus did not rule over Israel, but they ruled over him and killed him. And what they say that whoever was from antiquity was a god is a lie, for God precedes the old days, and it is said of old from ancient times was his origin, meaning that then he came, and the God is primal without beginning.
Yeah, so it seems like from the ancient days thing. There is of course the reference there in Micah, but as well it probably I mean it's certainly later developed with Daniel, the vision in Daniel, which
Yeah.
I think we'll get to.
Oh, speaking of Daniel, this is something out of place, but actually Maimonides in Mishneh Torah Kings and Wars 11 says that Jesus is like prefigured in Daniel's prophecies, but in the other way around. He writes in 11:6, Jesus of Nazareth, who aspired to be the Messiah and was executed by the court, was also alluded to in Daniel's prophecies, as in 11:14 states, the vulgar among your people shall exalt themselves in an attempt to fulfill the vision, but they shall stumble. And he further writes in section 7, ultimately, all the deeds of Jesus of Nazareth and that Ishmaelite who arose after him, i.e. Muhammad, will only serve to prepare the way for the Messiah's coming and the improvement of the entire world, motivating the nations to serve God together, as Zephaniah 3:9 states, I will transform the peoples to a pure language that they will call upon the name of God and serve him with one purpose.
Yeah.
Oh.
That's a traditional Jewish view of both of Christianity and Islam. Is like, why would God create these religions? And it's like, to pave the way to like prepare the pagan for the idea of a one God or a,
or a messianic figure. I do love it. It's actually a less contrived use of prophecy than many I've heard from a Christian source. So I have to give Maimonides that. It's kind of amusing, and yet it's very much the religious idea. You'll all see, I'll be proven right in the end, and they never are.
I mean, knowing Maimonides, I would think that that was probably not that serious. Like, I don't think he was necessarily saying this is a prophecy about Jesus. I think he's trying to say that Jesus is more like this part of the prophecy than he is what he's trying to claim that he is. And
a bit like a type of Antichrist.
He's not saying that he is. Yeah. I don't think he's necessarily saying that Jesus is prophesied in Daniel. I think he's saying that if you look at Daniel, he actually looks more like he fits this part than that part.
Well, and Christians do the same thing.
Maybe.
Everyone they don't like is, one of the false prophets and a type of Antichrist and blah, 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 blah. So,
yeah. I mean, the quote that Thomas just read, I think is pretty apt.
I have one more thing to say. So because I also focus on critical stuff, I'm not a biblical scholar. Just so everyone I'm an amateur in this. I'm focused on math, but I found in the commentary by Anderson and Friedman about Micah in page 463, they write, the quotation of this text in the New Testament in Matthew 2:6 lacks the latter phrase. In its place, it reads land of Judah. In this respect, the reading in 8 Hever 12 Greek is noteworthy. It has oiko phratha. There is a discontinuation there, like the Septuagint, but lacks Bethlehem. There does not seem to be a case for recovering House of Ephrathah from these Greek translations. The name has no other attestation. In the rendering of verse 1, Matthew, or his source, has added a negative, inverting the meaning of the Hebrew original. You are not the least among the princes of Judah. In addition, Matthew's rendition of Alfei as hegemones, or rulers, implies a reading Alufei, which is valid in Genesis 36:15, Exodus 15:15, and 1 Chronicles 1:51. Matthew has identified the word as referring to the ruler, not to Bethlehem, as a tribal entity.
And that he would practice miracles and healings.
So that comes from Isaiah 53:4, which says, "Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted."
So, what is that really saying? Because I'm guessing it's not really talking about Jesus from the Jewish perspective.
No, not even a little. So this is part of the servant songs, and so I think it was the late 1800s. Maybe my date's a little bit wrong, but so there's this guy Bernard Doom, and he was doing this study on Isaiah, and he picked out these 4 sections, which there's debate on where they begin and end, but the sections he labeled as the servant songs, and like nowhere in there do they say that they are the servant songs, but he hypothesized that these were like independent songs that were later included in Isaiah, or that when Isaiah was writing these things were included, and that they all refer to the servant who's going to suffer and die for the people. That's the general idea. So that early work was done by Bernard Doom, and the thing is, the vast majority of scholars today, they will look at the servant songs and tell you that it's about Israel, that it is all metaphorical language for Israel, that Israel will suffer and come back and all this stuff, and it's gonna get so the verse here, right, where they carry, he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yeah, so like the carrying of sin, right? So there are a few ideas that go into this. So I have a video called the who is the suffering servant, and I go over these passages in pretty good detail.
I'll include a link to that, by the way, in
Sure
the
thing.
description.
So the main idea here is one of a corporate personality, where one person can represent the whole and the whole can represent the one. And this is seen in a few places in the Bible in different ways.
Pas
Like,
pro toto, it's called.
what is it?
I think pas pro toto, like the
Oh, okay. Yeah.
the part
So
represents the whole. Yeah.
there are a few places where this happens. And of course, Isaiah is one of them. And once we get to the whole atonement for the community through a sacrifice, that's another section of that, wherever that pops up. And then even in Genesis, with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, like we have Lot potentially acting as a corporate personality. So like that's why it's like eventually Abraham argues God down to like, well, what if there's one good person, so the idea is in many places in the Bible, and this is just another of those occurrences, and the vast majority of scholars accept that this is about Israel. Israel is often personified in the Bible. I think there's something in the Song of Solomon where it specifically has like the marriage to Israel. I think that's in it's in that work. So so often Israel is personified, and this is another case of Israel being personified. Now, my own opinion is a little different than the consensus view. I think it's more of an idealistic view of like what it means to be a perfect follower, that you can like suffer through this stuff but still maintain faith and stuff like that. But that is a minority view. The consensus view by a vast margin is that this is supposed to be Israel. And that applies to all the servant songs. So I think almost every passage from Isaiah that we are going to be talking about today is almost every passage, not all of them, is from one of the servant songs.
I believe so. I actually have a question, Isaac and Tomer. I understood that it is part of Jewish theology that there is an element by which being God's people means being a representative for good in the world and having to suffer the consequences of evil, not just for one's own evil, but as a sort of almost like a scapegoat. And well, history has no doubt brought that about to some degree. It does seem to be very much in line with the suffering servant usage of this chapter. Do you have any
Yeah,
experience with that?
there definitely is that. There's
Oh boy.
also like, it kind of goes both ways as well, sort of like, if the Jewish people or the people of Israel are sinning, then that will affect the whole world as well. Like there's the phrase like nation of priests,
Or
light
that
to the
sins,
nation. Yeah.
or that sins of Jews result from actions against Jews. I've seen like ultra orthodox say that or something. I don't know.
Oh, you're saying like as punishment for their sins,
Yeah.
anti-Semitism,
Something like that.
stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very controversial, but there are like some extreme rabbis that have said things like the Holocaust were punishment for like in the Enlightenment, like
Yeah.
Jews becoming more secular and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's good to know
We
Pat
have the same
Robertson is
thing. We have the same thing in this country. We had Pat Robertson, for example, said that there was a terrible earthquake in San Francisco because he said, and this was 1992 or three, he said that the United States was the only country that allowed homosexuals to live, and that's why God visited San Francisco with a major earthquake.
And then I think there was like some polar vortex that I think he was also calling it like the gay vortex or something like that. I could be misremembering it, but
okay.
he also thought that it was like from like,
He could
people being
not the
allowed
gay
to be
whirlwind. Missed opportunity.
gays are very
Well,
powerful, apparently.
so what's his reasoning for all of those tornadoes hitting the south?
Well, we don't ask for reasoning from Pat Robertson, because in the same year we had,
No.
I think it was Monterey, California, had some kind of natural disaster that caused billions of dollars of damage only because everything in Monterey was stupid expensive, but no loss of life.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, and I think that might have been an earthquake, but meanwhile we have a tropical storm, and I think it was Haiti again. I'm going back to like 1991, 92, somewhere there. There was a tropical storm that didn't cost a whole lot of damage because everything is dirt ass cheap. Everybody's house is $50, but thousands and thousands of people died. And so Pat Robertson only looked at the dollar value of the property, not the total in human lives. And so, the primarily religiously motivated Haiti therefore didn't count very high on God's sin schedule. So it doesn't matter that tens of thousands of people died if there was only, hundreds of dollars in damage. What matters is Monterey, where there's no loss of human life, just somebody's mansions fell over.
That is so appropriate. I have no words. Incidentally,
So
Canada here, we legalized gay marriage 10 years before America, and Vancouver has not yet fallen into the sea via earthquake or anything. So, yay.
Tomer, do you have any commentary on this?
Yeah. First of all, I don't know if that is relevant, but there is in Talmud Sanhedrin 98a a claim where the Messiah will sit with poor people who have diseases. Like I'll quote this from and what is his identifying sign? Elijah answered, he sits among the poor who suffer from illnesses, and all of them untie their bandages and tie them all at once. Messiah unties one bandage and ties one at a time, etc. So I don't know if that's contradicting, but you wouldn't expect the Messiah to not heal, right? I don't know.
Yeah. So I think one of the important things that we should cover is like throughout the Old Testament, like this Jewish view of a new heaven and a new earth, and it's kind of hinted at. It's hinted at all throughout the Old Testament, but then it gets far more concrete with a book like Daniel. So the idea is that, and we're gonna get into the resurrection stuff, but the idea is that in the end times, in the end days, like on Judgment Day, when God comes back to judge everybody, he will bring with him this new world. Essentially, everything will be remade into like this perfect state, and everyone gets to like live with God happily or whatever, if they were not sinners, of course. But one of the things that is important for this to note is the subversion, the flipped social norms. So like the poor become rich, for example. That's why Jesus says like the meek will inherit the earth. Like that's a specifically Jewish thing. This is hinted at throughout the Old Testament, that in the end times, not even just in the end times, but in this new kind of environment, the ideal is to have everything flipped on its head. That things are going so poorly now that in the future they will all be flipped. Everything will be reversed.
Now
I just
when
wanna
it
say-
comes to, sorry,
So I just want to say something about Isaiah 53 and like Lawrence was
35.
saying about how. Sorry,
that's 35. No,
no, I'm talking about
wait,
Isaiah
no, that's
53.
but there is in 35 as well. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened.
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah. About him healing, yeah.
Yeah.
that's true.
So yeah, my commentary is referring to that specifically because that's basically the same thing.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's true. Yeah, I just want to say that about the Isaiah 53, the servant songs, or as you call it, or I think it's also known as the suffering servant. Yeah, the traditional, not traditional, the what was the view you said? The more accepted view is that this is about the people of Israel, and also that's like
Yeah.
the Jewish traditional view. But I have seen some evidence that like there was a period during the Second Temple where certain Jewish what they called end of the world people, what they called
Boomers.
apocalypticists. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, sorry, let's start that again. Yeah, where certain Jewish apocalypticists would have looked at these bits about the suffering servant and actually seen a messianic story there. And so if that was a pre-existing idea, that the Messiah would have been a suffering servant of some sort, then it's very possible that Christians would have, especially after crucifixion, would have applied it to him. So there's two arguments against it, I would say. One is that this has nothing to do with the Messiah. It's not a messianic prophecy at all. And the other is it was seen as prophetic at the time and therefore written into the story to make Jesus fit the prophecy.
So I have some comments. So first, I'll quote for the Targum Jonathan on Isaiah. It reads, "Then the eyes of the house of Israel that were as blind to the law shall be opened, and their ears which were as deaf to listen to the sayings of the prophets shall listen. Then, when they see the exiles of Israel who are gathered and going up to their land, even as swift harts, and not to be checked, their tongue which was dumb shall sing for joy." This is Isaiah 35, 5-6. Rashi there comments, "The eyes of the blind shall be opened, those who are blind, not to recognize their fear upon them. And the ears of the deaf, who did not hearken to the voice of the prophets until now, will be opened and unstopped. For I will give them a proper spirit to fear me." He says this concerning Israel, whom he called blind and deaf, as the matter is stated in 42:18, "You deaf ones, hearken," etc. And Kimchi writes, "The eyes shall be opened of Israel, who are in the exile, I think, and are like the blind, the lame, and the dumb." And one of my favorite biblical scholars is Amos Chacham, who has more of an Orthodox Jewish views, but I still really like his commentary. So in his commentary on Isaiah, Volume 1, page 362-3, this is my translation. "In the day of salvation, all those with defects will be cured, and it is also a special promise for those returning from the exile, who will all be healthy and well, and neither will have defect nor disease, which might delay them going to the upright road to Israel. There is also a hint that in the day of salvation, all will know of the truth of God, the Lord of Israel, and will hear the words of his prophets. The people for which it is said, 'Stop its ears and seal its eyes,' in 6:10, will repent from their mistake and confess the truth."
That reminds me of one of the one of the children's books that we had growing up was I can't remember what the title of the book was. It was like when Mashiach, when the Messiah comes, what will the world be like? And it's like, you know, a child asking questions and getting the answer, and it's lots of like nice pictures, and you have like the lion sleeping with the lying with the lamb, and giant fruit for some reason, and one of them, of course, is like there will be the sound of the shofar blowing, and everyone will hear. And then in the pictures, you always, you know, there's people with like crutches and someone in a wheelchair, and they're dropping their crutches, they're getting out of the wheelchair, and they're like walking, like they're cured, right? So that's seen as like a very like basic thing that's supposed to happen when the Messiah comes, is like there'll be no illness, no sickness, and yeah.
And that's very much what Christians are still promising themselves and others, that Jesus will someday bring when he comes back, because he screwed it up the first time, I guess.
That he would be betrayed by a friend.
Right, so Psalms 41:9, even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate of my bread, has lifted the heel against me.
So I did mention this before, but this applies to this psalm as well. This is not a prophetic claim. They're not prophecies. They're psalms about the enemies of the psalmist in their own time.
Mhm.
So it's about the future liberation of the psalmist, or at least his vindication, in his own time. So whether it be, I think there's another one that's supposed to be, you know, about the betrayal by a friend. I think it's what is it, Psalm 55. They're not about some future Messiah. They are the psalmist himself saying, like, look around me, there are all these enemies. Even my friends have become my enemies. Like it's not about Judas.
No.
Yeah, I should.
And sorry,
Go ahead,
I just
go ahead.
wanted to point out that we haven't quite gotten there yet in the story of David in the Blasphemers Bible study, although by the time people are watching this, we may very well have. But David's story is full of a lot of internal betrayal by family, betrayal by close allies, crossing and double crossing, and in some cases, triple crossing when Absalom manages to take over Jerusalem and he sends one of his friends back as a double agent. There's a lot of internal conflict and a sense of betrayal and being driven before your enemies. All of this is completely descriptive of the story of David. And even in a Christian Bible, it says, you know, Psalm 41, a Psalm of David, Psalm 55, a Psalm of David, all these Psalms of David, for the director of music for Psalm of David, a Maskil of David, all these things. So everyone recognizes that this is about David. The desire to draw parallels between David and the Messiah, especially because you have this kingly, everlasting language used, very much, "O King, may you live forever" vibes, very normal for that time and that area of the world. It's misappropriation to someone's particular political and ideological ends. And there's nothing original about it. There's nothing unique about Jesus in this. It's just one more person that wants to take something out of context to justify what they want to believe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
even
forgot that the reference that I got from Isaac actually included two quotes from Psalms 41 and Psalms 55. Isaac, can you read the Psalm 55?
Yeah, so Psalm 55, verses 12 through 14. It is not enemies who taunt me. I could bear that. It is not adversaries who deal insolently with me. I could hide from them. But it is you, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend, with whom I kept pleasant company. We walked in the house of God with the throng.
Yeah, changing it from like third person to first person is it's very anime. Like I could totally see him going like you know, while he's praying to God, he's like, "It is not enemies who taunt me. I could bear that. It is not adversaries who deal insolently with me. I could hide from them. But it is you, my equal, my companion." Like just kind of
Yeah.
I could totally see that being in an anime.
Lawrence,
I like how
Lawrence,
we both slipped up there.
is it over 9,000?
It is over 9,000.
When it comes to what Lawrence said on the whole like this is referring to like David's friends betraying itself. This is also what the traditionals actually said. For example, Talmud Sanhedrin. Oh, I think somebody wants to say something.
No?
Never mind. So Talmud Sanhedrin 106b reads, and Rabbi Yochanan says, initially David called Achitophel his teacher, and eventually he called him his colleague, and ultimately he called him his student. As it is stated, even my own familiar friend in whom I trusted. End quote. And the Targum on Psalms, it reads, but it is you, Achitophel, a man like me, a teacher who instructed me, and one who made me to know wisdom, etc. We used to hold harmonious council together in the house of the sanctuary of God. We walked briskly. May condemn them with the sentence of death and decree evil against Doeg and Achitophel. And even Isaiah Ditrani, who wrote that the ally refers to Shimi and Achitophel, who were David's allies before they betrayed him. So,
Yeah, and it's I think we mentioned it before, but just to make sure we don't miss the point here, the way it currently exists in the text, it would be, from the standpoint of David. But these were probably not actually from David. They were probably later attributed to David because of David's association with the lyre, his musical ability.
That he would be betrayed specifically for 30 pieces of silver. How'd they know that hundreds of years before?
So he's quoting Zechariah 11, verses 12 through 13. I then said to them, if it seems right to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. So they weighed out my wages, 30 shekels of silver. Then the Lord said to me, throw it into the treasury, this lordly price at which I was valued by them. So I took the 30 shekels of silver and threw them into the treasury in the house of the Lord.
Yeah, so what's funny about this verse is kind of like the sarcasm from Zechariah. He's like, 30 shekels, what a lordly price. What an amazing price that is. So the sarcasm is quite funny. So in Matthew 27, Judas gives back the money he was paid, 30 shekels, to the priests. And it says that he threw it into the temple, and he uses like the very similar language here. But then the priests use it to buy the potter's field. So interestingly, so because it was bought with blood money, what they call blood money, they called it the field of blood, which actually contradicts the story we get, I think, in Acts about why it's called that.
Yeah.
The Luke Acts author, yes.
Yeah.
I was going to say, like, there's two different stories of this.
There are, yeah. But either way, 30 shekels are included. So Zechariah is throwing the silver into the treasury. Now, what's interesting is that Matthew understood this. He probably understood it as potter, because the words sound very similar. So, like in the Septuagint, there probably was like some minor change that went from potter to, that went from treasury to potter. So he understood it that way, because it says that he gave it to the potter. But from what I could find, no ancient Jewish source even interprets this as like a prophecy of the future. So Zechariah is, he's a prophet who would have seen this fall of Israel and Judah, but he talks about the shepherds a lot in this chapter. So he kind of eschews the shepherds or the leaders of the community that were before him, and then he takes up that role himself. And apparently they don't really like that much. There's this metaphor with two staves and whatnot. One is called a favor. The other, I forget what the other one's called. But one's called favor. And then by the end of it, both of the staves are broken. Oh yeah, favor and unity. That's what they were. Favor and unity.
Wow.
So like God's favor and then the unity of Israel and Judah. And now when it comes to the he's very clearly talking about people who would have existed then with him. So I mean, the payment for prophecy was pretty common. people, because prophecy was a job. You were hired to be a prophet, so you would get paid for it. But then in some cases, you would have prophets like Amos, for example, saying that they have like other methods of making money, of earning a living. The way it's kind of viewed is that being paid for prophecy is kind of the antithesis of real prophecy. Like you should just prophesy because you have this ability, not because you want to get paid. So when Zechariah breaks one of his staffs, this section is kind of like he's basically given up now because no one has like accepted him as like this leader. So in so many words, he essentially is saying like, see how much your shit sucks, pay me, bitches, and just kind of get it over with. Just do your stupid little customs and give me my money and let me get the fuck out of here. And then he ends up giving that money to the treasury. This is not a prophetic thing at all. Not even a little bit, actually.
Yeah.
This is like a narrative that's happening within the text of Zechariah.
Yeah.
And actually, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
The coincidence, like, of the number is not so. Oh, sorry, I'll be very quick. So there's two coincidences here. You could say not prophecy, which is the number of the amount, which is just it's a very like a normal amount to use. And then it says threw them into the treasury. The Hebrew doesn't say throw; it says send forth, deposit. Like it's not actually saying throw. I wouldn't translate those words as throw, and it seems that that's been done on purpose to make it align with. Did you say Matthew?
Yeah, it's Matthew 27.
Yeah.
While you guys chat, was it Matthew 27? I'm actually going to check the Greek and then the Septuagint. So.
Oh, okay.
I was thinking actually more of the Old Testament, because as you pointed out, Isaac, and my first thought, 30 pieces of silver is not a special or unique number. Because of Christianity, because of the trope, we think of betrayal and blood money and that now. But 30 pieces of silver, and I'm trying to find the exact reference, I believe it's in Exodus, was the price to be paid if you accidentally killed someone's slave. Like, it's the value of a life that is not terribly highly valued. And so it's, again, this is not a surprising number. If it was $37.42, that would be very specific and unpredictable. This is not. This is just a very normative quantity of money. Not all that much considering the things involved, prophecy, life and death. And really, it's way more emphasis is placed on this than is justified by the history of the text.
It reminds me that the commonly used the amount of money that we commonly hear. It reminds me of this hilarious T-shirt I saw. I'm not gay, but $20 is $20.
In this economy, yeah.
So I have a couple of quotes. So first from Talmud Chulin 92a, quote, Rabbi Yehuda says, these are the 30 righteous individuals among the nations of the world, in whose merit the nations of the world continue to exist. Ula says, these are the 30 mitzvot that the descendants of Noach initially accepted upon themselves, but they fulfill only 3 of them, end quote. And I actually like Rashi that he says that I do not know how to explain the expression here of 30 pieces of silver exactly, but he notes the Chulin 92a, but he also notes that the number 30, quote, the number 30 is explained by the Midrash Agadah in Genesis Rabbah 49.3 and Pesikta de Rav Kahana 88a, that our father Abraham was promised that no generation could have fewer than 30 righteous in men. The number of Genesis 15.8, quote, so shall your seed be, end quote. The word Yihiyeh has the numerical value of 30. And Targum reads, and I said to them, if it is good in your eyes, fulfill my will, and if not, refrain. And some people fulfill my will. Kevin J. Cathcart and Robert P. Gordon, who commented on the Targum, they write, whether Christian appeal to this verse as a proof text has influenced Targum's treatment of these verses can only be surmised.
For clarification, I did find the reference. It's Exodus 21:32, where if the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave. The bull must be stoned because the life of the slave is valued at 30 shekels. So,
Okay. You put a value on human life.
That he would be betrayed by someone with a short life.
For some reason, this is Psalms 109:8. May his days be few. May another seize his position.
Yeah, I mean, this is the same
Oh,
deal as before.
I
Another
should
psalm.
correct this because that's the Hebrew Bible. That's the numbering of the Hebrew Bible, but there is the numbering of the Old Testament, right?
Oh, it's not a 109:8. It's 109.
Oh, sorry. No, I thought you meant for some reason. I thought you. Sorry. That's my mistake. Yeah, let his days be few. Yeah, sorry.
Is this referring to Judas?
Well, I mean, it's the idea is that it's supposed to refer to Judas, but still, no. This is still talking about the enemies of the psalmist. And the thing is, it's really weird because I think in this section, there's actually a difference between the versions there, the different translations there. Because one, let me pull it up here, was Psalm 109. So in, I forget which one says it's lacking, right? So in verse 6, this is part of the quotation, right? So the Hebrew lacks, they say. So in some manuscripts, it would be this section would actually be interpreted as being said by the opponents. So like in this psalm, so the psalmist is speaking. He's like, this is for verse 5. So they reward me evil for good and hatred for my love. And in the Hebrew, it would just go on to appoint a wicked man against him, let an accuser stand on his right. So like this is still the psalmist talking about like, hey, do all this stuff to my enemies, right? But in some manuscripts, and I'll check the Septuagint in a second, they don't have they say, or sorry, they include they say. So instead, he's saying like, this is what my opponents say about me. So it's actually quite funny now. So to the best of my knowledge, all the gospel authors use the Septuagint. They reference the Septuagint a lot. Sometimes they misreference it, which is kind of funny. Like I think even from before when we were talking about the prophecy in Zechariah in the New Testament, it's quoted. Or sorry, is it the prophecy from Zechariah? Yeah, I think it's the prophecy from Zechariah. Or was it Micah? It might have been Micah. All right, I think it was Micah. The section is quoted as being from Jeremiah, but the actual quotation is from Micah.
yes.
So that's actually really funny to me that they would fuck it up so bad. But then there was like this argument to be made that part of the verse they pulled from Micah, and then the other part they were pulling from something else.
You have to love that's the best way to get your prophecies is to stitch random parts of two different sentences from two different prophets together.
Right,
that's
yeah.
accurate.
Right, they do enjoy that quite a bit. So I think in the let me check here. So this is verse 6, but it would be in the Septuagint at least. This would be a little different, right? This is a different chapter, I think. Or is it a different chapter? It may or may not be a different chapter. It looks like it is from a different chapter. Just the numbering is a little bit different. But it is, to me, it is quite interesting that some manuscripts would include they say there, because you kind of have two possible interpretations, right? If you're pulling from one set of like from one manuscript tradition, this would actually be what the opponents say. Like the way this is interpreted in the New Testament, this would be what the opponents say about Jesus.
Mm.
But in other cases, it could be interpreted as like this is what is said about the opponents. So it's one side or the other. Who is it coming from? Which is kind of to me that's very interesting. The people that translated the NRSVUE, they opt for the original reading as being they say. So they opt for the original reading being that this is something that the opponents say about the life being cut short.
And Jesus' life is cut short. He
Yeah, oh
does
my
have
god,
a short
totally. Yeah,
life.
either way.
But either way, at the same time, this is a very standard curse. If someone has betrayed you, if you have enemies, you're like, wishing, especially when it's a struggle of life and death, as it is in the stories of David and the stories of Jesus, wishing for your enemy's time to be cut short as much for your own safety as anything else. Very typical, very normal, not at all special and prophetic. If prophecies involve the most common casual sayings being reinterpreted to mean something special, I'm sorry, it's absurd.
Yeah. So in short, not a prophecy, not messianic, not specific.
Not at all.
Yeah.
So I couldn't really find like commentators, at least traditional commentators, specifically talking about "May his days be few." They like talking about his position in Hebrew "pekudato," which is so Jewish, I have to say. But I did find Chacham, who also wrote a commentary on Psalms. He interprets the curses as pointing to the punishment that awaits a false conspiring witness who must suffer the penalty that he wished to inflict upon the person against whom he falsely testified. He writes that these curses, quote, may possibly be based on a set formula of threats and warnings that were given to a witness who came to offer testimony in a capital case. Such a witness was warned that if he were found to be a false conspiring witness, he and his family would be punished in such manner, end quote. And he writes in volume 3, page 133, he notes three more interpretations. Quote, 1. These curses are not directed at the psalmist's personal enemies, but at the eternal enemies of the people and the God of Israel, as symbolized by Edom and Amalek, according to Rashi and Sfono. According to a variation of this approach, these curses are directed at those wicked members of the Jewish people who have severed themselves from the people, and who are seeking to uproot the Torah and cause it to be forgotten. 2. These curses are words of rebuke that were said in a prophetic spirit as a warning and threat to the wicked, similar to the words of rebuke found in the Torah and to the harsh prophecies of doom found in the prophets. And 3, what we have here are not curses expressed by the psalmist against his enemies, but the opposite curses that those enemies are expressing against the psalmist. The psalmist cites his enemies' words in complaint. My enemies say such and such about me, end quote. And I also found out in Hosfeld's commentary on Armenia in volume 3, page 137, regarding the quotation in Acts. He writes, quote, the quotation from Psalms 109.8b has a twofold function, both to legitimate the choice of Matthias and to answer the unsettling question of how it could happen that an apostle called by Jesus, who, quote, was allotted his share in this ministry, and quote, according to Acts 1:17, could come to such a shocking end. Acts 1:20 most probably understands Psalms 109:6 verses 19 as the desires of the persons praying against his enemies, and so applies them to Judas. This biblical application of Psalms 109.8b to Judas was the origin of the fact that the church tradition designates Psalm 109 as Psalmus Iskarioticus, and then even interpret the psalm as a biblically legitimate cursing of the Jews, quote unquote, as a whole, according to Athanasius and Augustine.
That he would be rejected by the Jews.
So for this apparently would come from Psalm 118, 22 through 24. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. So
Now,
what comes up?
doesn't the notion that the Messiah would be rejected by the Jews fly direct in contradiction to Isaiah 11 and 27? I mean, because they're saying he's going to unify them, that he's going to
Yes.
gather all the Jewish people
Right,
from
yeah.
exile and return to Israel.
Yeah. So this idea about him being rejected. So in the psalm that this is apparently from, or that this is apparently like a prophecy of, this is the psalmist thanking God for what he has done, for basically giving him salvation, for saving him. And part of what he says here is that, like, this is past tense, right? The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. So this person that you initially that was initially rejected is now, like, the most important figure. Uh, and then he thanks God for that. This is past tense. This has already happened, according to the psalmist. This is, again, not a prophecy.
No. No, and it doesn't say rejected by the Jews, it says rejected. Find
By his
me one.
enemies.
Yeah, by his enemies. Gee, who is rejected by their enemies? Only everyone? That's what the word means, at least partially. It's very, yeah, it's very much a stretch. And the truth of the matter is, we've seen, in any prophet, in any leader, and especially in the life of David, which again we refer to over and over and over again when we read the Psalms, because that's what most of them are about. He has periods. He's rejected by his father-in-law. He has to leave his friends behind. He's betrayed here and there and everywhere. And, it gets very tropey, but the stories definitely already existed and were part of the consciousness here. So seeing that in the Psalms is the most expected thing you could possibly have. And to use it as an idea for Jesus that, the Jews would reject him. It doesn't say the Jews. There's no indication of the Jews. It's his enemies reject him. His enemies rejected David. Some of his people rejected him during a coup. Definitely there's a sense of betrayal there. But again, it's really reaching to interpret it the way Christians do.
Yeah, and I would also say that so I mentioned this before, but the main opponents in the book of Psalms are the wicked. And in my view, it seems like the wicked, from reading many Psalms multiple times, it actually kind of sucked. I did, and when we read the Psalms on Atheist Sunday School, and then later on I did like another study of the Psalms, and I had to reread them again, which fucking sucked. But anyways, the main opponents are the wicked, and the wicked, in from what I can tell, actually aren't. you and I actually did I don't know what you want to call it, like a show on this, that the fool that's talked about, it would be like describing the wicked, and they're a group of people that they wouldn't really take these lessons to heart. So like they would do like the public, functions and all that stuff, all the public religious rituals, but then in their personal lives, they wouldn't really care about it. They would eschew those godly things and do something else entirely. So they're essentially hypocrites. And that is like, those are the wicked. So the people who would be, if we kind of take that idea of the wicked being the main opponents, this is more likely then to refer to those kind of hypocritical early Israelites that would have rejected like such a strong pious leader initially, but in the end he won out, according to this psalm.
So I should note that again, the traditionals interpreted the builders, or at least the stone of the builders, the stone of the builders, to be like the people, a group of people. Well, Yeah, but sorry, let me repeat that again. I was blanked out. So Rashi wrote that the stone that the builders rejected, a people that was humble among the peoples. And Ibn Ezra writes, this was said figuratively. The nations disdained the psalmist, but he overcame them in the end. On the other hand, the psalmist might be speaking under the influence of the Holy Spirit of Israel in exile. And Kimchi writes, if this is said about Israel, then all of Israel is called a stone, quote unquote, as in there the shepherd, the rock of Israel, in Genesis 49:24. By way of parable, for Israel are the main building of the world. And the builders who rejected them, these are the kings of the earth, who establish a building to the world with their laws and decrees upon humans. And here Israel is rejected in exile, and the builders rejected them, meaning that even if it'll be one of the stones of the building, it shall be a cornerstone, meaning that they are never needed, and they will be considered for destruction, end quote. And Chacham, in his commentary, volume 3, page 197, writes, this is a simile. The stone that the builders initially rejected and refused to use in the construction of their building ultimately became the cornerstone of the building. In other words, it became the stone that is placed at the corner of the foundation of the building, where the floor and at least two walls meet. The psalmist here applies the simile to Israel, or to the commander of the army of Israel, or to the king of Israel, whom his enemies initially despised, detested, and avoided. Another explanation, it is possible that the psalmist said the stone that the builders rejected at the time when the pilgrims passed through the gates of Jerusalem and saw the stones of the walls of Jerusalem and its houses. We find that the enemies of Israel, such as Sanballat and Tobiah in the time of Nehemiah, mocked the stones of the walls of Jerusalem and said in Nehemiah 3:34 and 35, quote, will they revive the stones out of the heaps of dust which are burned? If a fox goes up, he will break down their stone wall, end quote.
I think I remember the cornerstone imagery popping up in one of the prophets. I think it it may have been Zechariah. It may have been a different one. I could just be misremembering. But they also have this metaphor of like rebuilding the temple and then building around that cornerstone.
It's one of the few prophecies applied to Jesus that he is supposed to have, at least in Luke, claimed for himself. The stone which the builders rejected has become either the cornerstone or the capstone of an arch. If anyone who falls on this stone will be cut to pieces, and if it falls on someone, it will crush him to dust. Again, it's metaphorical. The Ezra and Nehemiah, again, we haven't really gotten there, but that's definitely an important point in the history of the Bible and the writing of the Bible. At one point, they are rebuilding the wall with, a sword in one hand and a mattock in the other, all standing around trying to build themselves some semblance of initial fortifications when they first returned from exile. And so there would be, phrases about the sort of both the hopelessness and the hope of this task and how they were working to turn ruins into fortifications and how people doubted them and whatnot. So again, it's in a way some very beautiful imagery, but also, again, not really a prophecy in that sense.
That he would be beaten and spit upon. He would have his back whipped.
So this is Isaiah 56. I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who pulled out the beard. I did not hide my face from insult and spitting.
So this is also part of the servant songs. Same issue going on here. Supposed to be about Israel. Yeah, there's really not much more to say on these verses that I have not that I didn't already cover.
Tomer?
Yeah, I have a comment by Rashi who writes, I gave my back to smitters. He said to me, Isaiah, my children are obstinate. My children are bothersome. You may go on the condition that you do not become angry with them. I said to him, on that condition. And Chacham, in his commentary in volume 2, page 541, says, I gave my back to the floggers, i.e., I led those who disagree with me to hit me in the back, and I did not back down from the fury of the floggers. It was an ancient custom to hit the fools, quote-unquote, of the tribe at their backs, as we see in Proverbs 10:13, 19:29, and 26:3. And even if If those who disagree with me spit in my face to shame me, I will not hide them my face. I will not hide them my face, but I'll speak more to them directly. So.
And this is very much a vision of nobly enduring unjust suffering, which, you know, again, powerful imagery, something that I think can be told in many aspirational tales, to be the person who's strong enough to stand for their convictions, even when they take criticism for it. But again, the suffering of Christ, as much as Christians try and pretend it's something special and unique, and nobody has ever suffered that much in the whole history of the world, floggings, very normal in that whole part of the world for centuries. Beatings, all these things, not pleasant, not nice, but again, nothing unique, nothing special, and nothing that justifies the idea that these verses are somehow a prophecy of the Messiah that is, again, unique and special.
He would be grouped with criminals, as he was the thieves on two sides.
So this is Isaiah 53:12. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors.
So is it prophecy if according to the Christian mindset, does it become prophecy if it reminds you of Jesus, and that's why everything a Christian reads in the Old Testament becomes prophetic?
Yeah, probably.
Pretty much, yeah.
It's unfortunate, but yeah. The thing is, like, there are things like the Micah verse that we covered. That was actually a prophecy. Like, that was portrayed as a prophecy. It was written like a prophecy. That is not the case for a verse like this. Not prophetic. They have, and the thing is, when it comes to the suffering servant, right, a lot of people have been thought to be a representation of that. There is a what was it? There's an early interpretation of the suffering servant in the Wisdom of Solomon as well. I'm pretty sure it's the Wisdom of Solomon. There have been like Moses was at one point called the suffering servant. That was there was one rabbinical commentator who said it was Moses, and that's actually what Klaus Balzer actually in his commentary suggested as Moses as well. Hezekiah has been thought to be the suffering servant. A whole lot of people have been able to fit that mold, and were written to have fit that mold. But that is because this is I mean, in my view, it is meant to be vague, but when you're talking about someone who will suffer and die, and through whose sins you are atoned, it makes sense to put it on to someone like Jesus. But this is not a prophetic this is not a prophecy. Even though it's in Isaiah, it's not a prophecy, not written like a prophecy.
And it's not unique either. This is the idea of the suffering servant, which, as we've clarified with Tamara and Isaac, is something that is part of Jewish theology, or has become it, that there is a redemptive nature to the suffering of the Jewish people for themselves and for the world at large. And this promise at the end is basically, if you nobly endure this suffering and this role in the universe of bearing suffering for transgression to redeem yourselves and redeem the world, then in the next world, of course, you will be blessed, you will be honored, you will be lifted up, you will be given a portion among the great and divide the spoils with the strong. The meek shall inherit the earth. These are ideas that have seen many iterations throughout Judaism, and that have been part of this greater narrative that this is somehow the way the universe works, that nobly enduring redemptive suffering will bring the world to rights, and if you are able to do that, you will be rewarded in the future or the next life or your descendants. However, Christianity basically took that entire trope, put it on Jesus, and then just insisted that was the beginning and end of the whole thing, and nobody else had to nobly suffer for redemptive purposes because it was just all Jesus. He did it, the whole thing, one punch, done. And that's been their claim. So yes, every time this trope comes up in the Old Testament, they're going to see it as referring to Jesus. But it's been a part of Judaism in various forms for a really long time. What's the joke about every Jewish holiday? What is every Jewish holiday? They tried to kill us, we lived, let's eat.
Yeah. So I only have the so I have only the toggle reading because all the traditional commentators, at least in my understanding, most of the follow the reading that this refers to Israel, at least all of the chapter 53. So there is the Targum reading, which reads, "Then I will divide him the plunder of many peoples, and he shall divide the spoil, the possession of strong fortresses, because he handed over his soul to the death, and subjected the rebels to the law. Yet he will beseech concerning the sins of many, and to the rebels it shall be forgiven for him." And Bruce D. Chilton, in his commentary on the Targum, he writes, in a commentary translation, "Although there is no reference to anything like the suffering of the Messiah, imagery which was applied to Jesus in the course of Christian mission, neither is there any attempt to claim that the Messiah did not hand over his soul to the death in verse 12. Such an attempt would probably have been made if the purpose of the interpretation was to deny that the Messiah should die, as Jesus had. It would appear that such Christian claims were not in mind. Rather, the point of the phrase is probably that the Messiah risked his very life for the sake of his ministry. That appears to be the sense in which Isaiah 53:12 is applied to the hero Phinehas, compare Numbers 25:13, in Sifrei 131. As in the case of the Messiah of the Psalms of Solomon, compare 17 verses 27 and 29, and Targum in Isaiah, the Targumic Messiah is a zealous victor, a guardian of the righteous, in verse 8 and 9.
He'd be offered vinegar.
Well, if they don't have ranch, they don't have Thousand Island, they don't even have spicy Italian.
So Psalm 69:21. They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink.
Yeah, so let's take a. I mean, the thing is, there are often quotations and references to the Psalms in, especially in the Passion narratives, especially Psalm 22. But even with this Psalm, this is another reference to this, or to the Psalm, but it is once again like the original is not a prophecy. So if we were to take the original as a prophecy, it also says, like even just like the verse before, insults have broken my heart so that I'm in despair. I looked for pity, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none. The only person, or the only being, I guess, that I remember Jesus like asking for, to save him at all or to help him out was God. Now I could be misremembering. There could have been other occurrences, but when it comes to his death, because like if we're taking the they gave me poison for food and they gave me vinegar to drink, if we're taking that scene as part of this passion narrative, in terms of his death, he always knew he was going to die. That was kind of the point. And there was I forget which gospel it was, but one of them, he goes out, he prays, and he's like, please God save me and all this kind of stuff. But that's really the only time I remember him asking for help on this.
It's Luke. Luke in the Garden of Gethsemane, but not my will, but thine be done. He goes out and prays 3 times. The John, he's far more aware of what's going to happen and very noble about it and prays for his future disciples. But that being said, where's the poison food?
Yeah, where's the poison food? That too, yeah. Oh, but what? I bet someone takes it metaphorically to be like, oh, the poison food is actually the lies they were telling, or some stupid shit like that.
Like, I know, but vinegar is spoiled wine. You would not. It is an insult to a guest to serve them spoiled wine, but the poor and the destitute who have to buy the cheap wine, who can't afford to store it properly, are going to have poor wine that's a bit vinegary. And people drank wine back then because you couldn't just go around drinking water. You would die. Pathogens are a thing. So, cheap, gross wine that is part vinegar is something that, if you're wealthy enough, you could serve as a deliberate insult. And if you're poor enough, you would have nothing else to serve. It's like saying you served a flat Coke.
So traditional commentators generally see this psalm as referring to Israel, describing its suffering through the exile and the persecution by the enemies. For example, Rashi in verse 1 wrote that the psalm is concerning Israel, who are like a rose, Shoshana, among the thorns, which is pricked by the thorns. Likewise, Kimchi, Menachem Hameiri, and Sfono wrote that this is about the troubles of the exile, with Hameiri noting that some interpret that David said this upon himself and about his troubles. Kimchi writes, quote, "Even though I wanted to be happy and enjoying the exile, they bitter me with their quarrels against me, like someone who is hungry and wishes to eat, and they gave him gall, or like someone who is thirsty, and they gave him vinegar to drink." End quote. Chacham, in volume 2, page 104, writes, "The warning of the psalm suggests that the distress about which the psalmist laments is not his individual distress, but the distress of the community, the distress of the people of Israel, whose enemies pursue them, level false accusations against them, and taunt and blaspheme the people and the God of Israel. The psalmist prays on behalf of the people because he feels personally upon his own flesh the sufferings of the entire nation. He acts zealously on behalf of God's house, and he deeply mourns its desecration and the desecration of God's name caused by the enemy's blasphemies. Members of the psalmist's people, and even members of his own family, pursue the physical pleasures of life and mock the psalmist for his mourning and for his zeal for God and his house."
So we're all out of Dom Perignon, but I do have some Mad Dog 2020.
His garments would be divided.
Oh, okay. So Psalm 22:18. They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots.
Now, as we've said again before a number of times, if it's from Psalm, they're talking about somebody else back in their own time, the psalmist, not Jesus.
Right.
Well,
Although these psalms were used by the evangelists to write this narrative. So, like Psalm 22:18 is an example. In also earlier in the same psalm, we get the famous quotation, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I think that's from Psalm 22, right? Yeah.
I think it is.
So that's specifically something that Jesus says. So it's very clear that the writer knew Psalm 22 very well. So in writing his passion narrative, we have the inclusion of this as well to kind of call back to it.
Yeah, of all the things, this is one of the most obviously easy to script into the narrative rather than it actually happened. You have this story concocted in one of the Gospels where they're sitting around bored waiting for the prisoners to die, and they're like, let's play some dice and divide up these poor people's garments, because they're really going to want that. A Roman soldier is going to want some dirty, transient guy's robe. Sure. This is very clearly scripted, and very much scripted to fit the prophecy into the narrative. It's painfully obvious, and it's exhausting and rage-inducing how hard Christians will work to not even acknowledge that that's possible. It's just, nope, couldn't be, nope.
And I should note that some rabbis attributed this psalm to Esther Interestingly enough. So the Talmud Megillah 15b reads, the verse states with regard to Esther, quote, and she stood in the inner court of the king's house in Esther 5:1. Rabbi Levi said, once she reached the chamber of the idols, which was in the inner court, the divine presence left her. She immediately said, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Psalms 22:2. Perhaps it is because you judge an unintentional sin as one performed intentionally, and an action done due to circumstances beyond one's control as one done willingly. Or perhaps you have left me because in my prayers I called Haman a dog, as it is stated, deliver my soul from the sword, my only one from the hand of the dog, in Psalms 22:21. She at once retracted and called him in her prayers a lion, as it is stated in the following verse, save me from the lion's mouth, in 22:22. And also Talmud Yoma 29a reads, Rabbi Asi said, why was Esther likened to the dawn? It is to tell you, just as the dawn is the conclusion of the entire night, so too Esther was the conclusion of all miracles performed for the entire Jewish people. And Chacham, in Volume 1, page 168, writes, as is the case regarding many of the Psalms in the book, we cannot determine from this description the particular distress from which the psalmist cries out to be saved, and what exactly fills him with dread. The wording of the enemy's taunt, trust in the Lord, let him deliver him, and the wording of the psalmist's supplication, our fathers trusted in you, and the wording of his vow, all you, the seed of Jacob, glorify him, suggest that the psalmist's non-Jewish enemies are persecuting him because of his faith and trust in the God of Israel. This being the case, it is possible that the psalmist is not praying on behalf of himself alone, but on behalf of every member of the people of Israel who is being persecuted by the enemies of Israel, who wish to kill him and loot his property. Thus, it is possible that the psalm is referring to the entire people of Israel who are being persecuted by cruel enemies. The rabbis follow this approach and interpret the psalm as referring to Israel's troubles during the days of Haman in Tosafot on Megillah 4a and Midrash Tehillim 22:1. End quote. And Abraham Jacob Berkowitz in Ancient Readers and the Scriptures writes in page 225, quote, the pervasiveness of psalm quotation and allusion leaves no doubt that the gospel authors constructed their passion narratives with Psalm 22 in mind. Thus, Jews and later Gentile followers of the early Jesus movement saw Psalms 22 as a traditional prophecy of Jesus' execution. End quote. He further writes in page 239, quote, a thorough examination of rabbinic comments preserved in sources earlier than Midrash Tehillim reveals an active Jewish struggle with Christian interpretation. Jews became aware of Christian claims based on Psalms 22 by the late 2nd century. To combat the interpretation of Psalm 22 as Jesus, they arrogated and subverted aspects of the reading. They arrogated and subverted them by centering this psalm on the Esther narrative. Esther acquired the role of a true Jewish Christ, vitiating Jesus' claim to that title. These rabbinic comments represent one path some Jews took in undermining Christian claims. End quote. And also check out the article in the Torah.com, his article, my God, why have you forsaken me, Jesus or Esther?
It does make some sense for the Esther narrative because the impetus given to the people who were supposed to carry out the genocide was that they got to seize the property of the Jews they killed. So,
yeah. So, Esther is Galadriel confirmed. She was likened to the dawn and was green. So, yeah.
Ah.
None of his bones would be broken.
Okay, so there's two here. So Exodus 12:46, it shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the animal outside the house, and you shall not break any of its bones. Also Numbers 9:12, they shall leave none of it until morning, nor break a bone of it. According to all the statute for the Passover, they shall keep it.
What's this got to do with Jesus?
Well, there is a very common interpretation. I mean, by common interpretation, I mean it's literally in the Gospels, that Jesus is the Paschal Lamb, that he is the thing to be sacrificed. So,
and the Hebrew authors knew that when they wrote this?
Hell no. They're talking about the actual sacrifice. And then the gospel authors are like, well, what if that was actually Jesus? So they interpret Jesus to be that paschal sacrifice, which is why you have all this Jesus being the lamb imagery.
Yeah,
Also,
it's tropey.
yeah, but I should also note that there is Psalms 34:20 and 21 in the Hebrew Bible, which reads, "Keeping all his bones intact, not one of them being broken." And I've seen some that claim this also is a prophecy.
Yeah, a righteous man. Again, taken one verse in isolation. A righteous man may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all. He protects all his bones, not one of them will be broken. Evil will slay the wicked. The foes of the righteous will be condemned. This is just a totally average psalm talking about the hope for justice, that God will bring justice, that he'll protect the righteous. And yet half the time you end up with stories like Job and other psalms where it indicates that God did not protect the righteous. And why didn't you? Oh, you'll make it up to us someday. Of course you will. Yeah. And in the story, they write in that in order to make them die more quickly before the Sabbath, they broke the bones of the two thieves so that they would die more quickly because they wouldn't be able to hold themselves up. They would suffocate more quickly. But they didn't because Jesus was already dead. Let me make this clear. The Romans did not give a single shit about the Sabbath. They were very tolerant to religions as long as it did not interfere with the law and public policy. If you have traitors dying and it goes over the Sabbath and it's a big deal, they do not give a fuck. No fucks were ever given by the Romans on this point. Ever. This is an entirely Jewish concern that they would have had no way to implement, and a scripted narrative that they use to fit in more of this Pascal Lamb stuff into the narrative. It's completely unbelievable as an actual historical event. The only time the Romans would not give you an inch on your religion was when it came to civic law and the keeping of Pax Romana, which was kept with a lot of blood. So
I also want to point out that, okay, so Tor, maybe you can let me know here. So at the beginning of this psalm, Psalm 34, at the beginning of that psalm, so this is like, not talking about the Passover sacrifice. So it says here, at least in the NRSV UE, of David when he feigned madness before Abimelech, so that he drove him out and he went away. Is that a very long title that is added by the translators, or is that part of the text?
No, that's part of the Hebrew.
Okay, so we already have a context for it, which is not Jesus. And then, second of all, I want to point this out. This to me seems far more about the resurrection of the people, if anything, or at least having them in a good state so that they can be resurrected. So we have the imagery in like Ezekiel in the Valley of Dry Bones, where it's metaphorical, but like you have this dead Israel that is just a valley of dry bones, but then they all come back alive, and it's clearly about the restoration of the land and the restoration of the people. So even like in the context of this verse in Psalms, that if it were a prophecy, I mean, you got to look at the context. So like even in the previous stanza, it says that the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous and his ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against evildoers, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. And then in this stanza, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord rescues them from them all. He keeps all their bones; not one of them will be broken. Evil brings death to the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be condemned. The Lord redeems the life of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. This seems closer to kind of like a day of judgment idea, especially if you take the imagery from Ezekiel. It makes a lot of sense on why he keeps all their bones, not one of them will be broken. And not only that, but this is kind of the idea is that the bodies have to remain intact because it will be a very physical resurrection for the Jews. So if you were a pious Jew, you would get physically resurrected. You would physically come up out of the ground in your original body. So this seems to be much closer to that than it does about just the singular person of a Messiah. This isn't about the Messiah. This is about the group of righteous people being preserved for at least, I could definitely see this coming for like a context for the end times here, or for the day of judgment.
The final resurrection. Yeah,
yeah.
definitely.
In fact, we see that in Matthew because when all the holy ones come up out of the ground, it's
Yes!
exactly what he's talking about.
It's a trope, and it's led to many strange superstitions in Judaism and Christianity, both playing into this particular trope and playing against it, where Christians would not burn their dead because how would they be resurrected? But if they burned anyway, what would you do? You could say some kind of a prayer, where monks would laugh at the resurrection by emptying, like letting the flesh rot away and arranging their bones into certain monasteries. And they have these very strange, where they've like put art up the wall built out of the bones of the monks that have been there, as a sort of a bit of a laugh at the taking this too literally. Jews have had, again, that's part of the reason, in certain cases where you have very devout traditional Jews killed and there's blood, they'll cut out pieces of pavement that have blood in them and bury them in the Jewish cemetery. Again, not all. It depends on your level of devotion and how literally you take these things. But it's a trope for a long time.
Jews don't do cremation. Yeah, religious Jews anyway don't do cremation. Everything has to be buried.
This reminds me of conversations I had with my mom as a kid, because she said we can't be cremated because our body. My mother was Mormon, and she said we can't be cremated because our bodies have to be able to crawl out of their graves, on the judgment day or the last day or whatever the hell it is. And so you can't be cremated or you won't have a body left. I'm like, well, what about all the people that were eaten by sharks?
And the sea will give up their dead via several generations of ripping bits out of fish. I don't know. I don't know.
So Ibn Ezra writes, our clause means, if evil comes upon a righteous person, let him not give up hope, for God will save him from all evil. He keepeth all his bones. This means that no great harm shall even fall upon his organs. And Kimchi writes, for many times the Lord will try the righteous person for his favor, and to show his righteousness to humans, so that he will not break heart and not stray from the way of truth because of the trouble. And Chacham, in volume 1, page 263, writes, this psalm combines words of praise for God, who destroyed the wicked and protects those who take refuge in him, with words of instruction directed at the psalmist's audience about fearing God and placing one's trust in him. According to its content and format, this psalm was meant to be recited at a gathering of God-fearing people who were assembled to praise God and to strengthen themselves in their fear of God. The psalm is formulated in the singular and is addressed to the congregation, with the psalmist serving both as the congregational leader, conducting the prayer service, and as a preacher expounding ethical teachings and the fear of God to the members of the congregation.
He'd be buried in a rich man's grave.
Oh, yes. That was a funny one.
So Isaiah 53:9 again, so for, servant song. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth.
I can see where Christians would see the parallels. This reminds me of that.
Right. Yeah.
But I don't get where they get to say that this is a prophecy. And one Christian tried to explain it to me. Well, that when it's talking about this, it's really talking about that. It really is talking about that, but it's also secretly overlaid the second level, also talking about this.
Yeah, that's they are overdosing on copium is what they're doing. But I do want to point out here. So the translators of the NRSV UE, they do go with this reading. However, Alter translates it differently. He says, "And his grave was put with the wicked, and with evildoers his death." he says that the received text has "and with a rich man," ashir, which makes no sense either thematically or as a poetic parallelism. The translation is based on an emendation to osera. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Sorry, Tomer. The word for death is an odd-looking plural form, but a proposed emendation from bemoto to bamoto is dubious because there's scant evidence that the latter term ever means sepulchres, as scholars have claimed. In any case, the point of the line is that he was given a disgraceful burial.
And that's actually directly the opposite of the narrative. I also have in this particular translation is he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. It's the opposite. He died with the wicked, executed like a bad person, and buried with the rich. But the prophecy is reversed. And the entire narrative about him being buried in a rich man's tomb also comes off as a strange addition, and one that doesn't work with the actual traditions of how Romans treated the bodies of condemned criminals.
Oh,
They-
I feel like I know where this comes from. Okay, so where we were talking about the role reversal that's supposed to happen.
Mhm.
So he would be like not only considered by everyone as one of the rich, which means like you have to be condemned, but if they had his tomb with the rich, when in reality that was not the case, then you could still say that there is that essence of role reversal in
Mhm.
being placed in a, where you're not supposed to be, essentially. So that
Yeah.
might be where that comes from. But either way, this is from the servant songs, and this is specifically the last servant song, which is the one with the most parallels, the ones that they definitely used. They like the early Christian authors absolutely they quote from this. They cite this directly, so they are writing it into their narrative in many cases. But the thing is, the original one was not it is not a prophecy. It's more likely talking about if it was talking about a person or a group of people like Israel, it would have been like talking about their feelings then and there.
Yeah, the personification of the people. And honestly, all of 53 is quoted by the Christians and portions by the testaments themselves. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty. All of this stuff is used in the narrative of Jesus. And it's partly very poetic and very beautiful. But again, as with everything else, it's the trope of the personification of Israel and the burden of redemptive suffering carried by the people of Israel. And then the rich, admittedly, is a very weird insert here. It's not very well justified by the text, although there are definitely periods of time where the rich are condemned as greedy and evildoers, and it's one of the more sensible things the Bible says. But it's like you script your narrative out of this book and then refer to this book as justification that your narrative is true.
So I've actually I lifted the comment that I have now from actually when we've done the Book of Mormon from Mosiah 14, because that chapter basically copies from Isaiah 53. So, according to Blenkinsop, the rendition of the original Hebrew, Ve'et Ashir Bemotav, is unintelligible, since the word for rich, Ashir, is in the singular and does not make a good parallel with the wicked, Rashaim. He suggested to read Ashir as Osera, which means evildoers. Likewise, Shalom M. Paul notes that Ibn Janach interpreted Ashir as deriving from Rishaim. The word for his death, Bemotav, is corrected by Blenkinsop as Bemoto, his grave, since it is a parallel to the previous grave, Kivrav, Kivro, and is evident from the Isaiah scroll. Chacham interpreted this phrase to mean that the people of Israel marked graves with rich, quote unquote, as the Gentiles accused the Jews that they were rich from exploiting them. So the Gentiles killed them and mockingly marked on their grave, "This is the grave of the rich." And I've added the Targum, which reads, "And he shall deliver the wicked into hell, and the riches of treasures which they got by violence unto the death of Abaddon, that they who commit sin shall not remain, and that they should not speak folly with their mouth."
He'd be resurrected.
And this is weird that when they do something so sequential. I mean, it had the last prophecy was Isaiah 53:9. They made his grave with the wicked, blah, blah, blah. And then Isaiah 53:10, the very next verse, is so for a different prophecy. And Duco says that this one is that he would be resurrected. But Isaiah 53:10 says, "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with affliction. When you make this life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him, the will of the Lord shall prosper."
I think you got a misquotation there, because in the list that I have, he'd be resurrected. There's Isaiah 26:19, Daniel 12:1-3, Psalm 16:8-11, and Job 19:25.
Okay, that's not the one that I have on my list. So what have you got?
Interesting. Okay. So
Let's
yeah,
see.
on
But
this.
I think
Go ahead.
I think I've I've seen Christians use this. There is like a list from the messianic.org. Wait, let me check this real quick. 53:10.
I mean, they've definitely used all of Isaiah 53. That's for sure.
Yeah,
But
they quote it as the Messiah will be resurrected and live forever. 53:10.
oh,
Yeah.
Now
So
that
I think that
contradicts
refers
something
to-
else that I'd read. Somebody else was saying that the Messiah could not die.
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
weird because I have a different set of verses. But either way, this resurrection idea. So I'm if you just allow me, I want to quote some stuff in just a moment here. So when it comes to the resurrection, we talked about how there was supposed to be this big group, like this mass resurrection on the
Yeah.
day of judgment. But then there are other verses like in Daniel and I have here Isaiah 26:19. So I want to quote here from J.J. Collins, who is like the top. He's like the best scholar for Jewish apocalypticism. Uh, he quotes, I'm going to quote him here. A more difficult case is presented by Isaiah 26:19. Thy dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. O dwellers in the dust, awake and sing for joy. This passage is often taken as expressing a hope for the resurrection of individuals in the context of national restoration. The context, however, involves a contrast between the other lords who have ruled over Israel, who are now dead and will not live, and the nation that the Lord has increased. In this context, Isaiah 26:19 can be read by analogy with Ezekiel 37. And then also because I have stuff from Daniel. So even if one takes a maximalist view of the evidence for resurrection in the Hebrew Bible, the hope expressed in Daniel 12 was exceptional. At the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, which is when this was written, when Daniel was written, like in the mid 2nd century, I should say that. Ben Sira wrote that, quote, "Whether life is for 10 or 100 or 1,000 years, there is no inquiry about it in Hades." And that, quote, "From the dead as from one who does not exist, thanksgiving has ceased." The pessimistic conclusion of Kohelet, that's Ecclesiastes, the book of Ecclesiastes, quote, "All are from the dust and all turn to dust again," was unimpeachable on grounds of conformity to tradition. Daniel's use of biblical phraseology, especially from Isaiah, gave the impression of continuity with tradition, but the continuity was with a minority view and involved considerable innovation. No biblical text before Daniel had spoken even metaphorically of a double resurrection of the righteous and the wicked and a judgment of the dead. Daniel was not, however, the first Jewish author to speak of the judgment of the dead. And then he goes off to talk about first Enoch, especially. There's this pit in First Enoch that's specifically reserved for people who will come back, and a couple other texts as well. So that was from J.J. Collins, but I at least in the verses that I have written down, I don't know how we're looking at different lists here. But the expectation for a resurrection was something that was common by the time of Jesus.
Yeah, there was definitely I believe it was the Pharisees actually who believed in the resurrection of the dead at the final judgment, and the Sadducees who didn't, who were rationalists basically. But of course, the Pharisees survived as a group far more, and thus were more demonized by later Christian authors, despite the fact that they.
Tomer, help me out here. Was the Jewish Messiah supposed to die and be resurrected, or was it that he couldn't die at all?
No, he is already alive. Like he lives. He doesn't die. Like
The idea was that
he's never resurrected.
Yeah, that he was like hidden away. That was one of the things that was very common.
Actually,
occultation.
I think there is a
Sorry, what?
Occultation. The final. What was it? The last imam of the child. There, it's a tradition of occultation where a religious leader continues to live but exists invisibly, and you can't access them.
Okay.
I know that there is a tradition where every generation there is a Messiah who is born on the 9th of Av, which is the time of the destruction of the temple, right? So he's not, generally in Judaism, he's not dead, he's alive.
Okay.
So my comment originally was about Job 19:25, which reads, "But I know that my vindicator lives. In the end, he will testify on earth." So I wrote, my vindicator, Goali, is taken by Rashi to be God, as well as most traditional commentators and Targum. Ibn Ezra, however, took the vindicator to be flesh and blood, a view shared by Chacham, who writes on his commentary on Job, page 198, quote, "And at last on the earth he will rise." This means even if he is the last one to rise on the earth. The implied subject of the verb is my redeemer. Job realizes that his words are audacious and unlikely to be acceptable to his contemporaries, nor will coming generations acknowledge them quickly, but is entirely confident that at least one person will acknowledge Job's righteousness, and even if that person is the last human being on earth, for this world will ultimately be destroyed, that is enough to console Job, end quote. But Robert Gordis, however, rejects Ibn Ezra's interpretation in view of 1619 in the heavens and the clear implication that Job's redeemer may not merge until the end of time. He follows Rashi's reading and writes in pages 204 and 206, quote, "Since Job has demanded that his words be inscribed on a permanent memorial, the most natural view of this verse is to interpret it as expressing his assurance of future vindication, for he knows that his Redeemer is now alive. God as the Goel is the Redeemer from Egyptian bondage in Exodus 6:8 and from the Babylonian exile in Isaiah 43:14, 44:22 and 23. In personal relations, he is the avenger of wrong in Psalms 119, 154 and Proverbs 23:11. It is God to whom Job appeals and whom he sees rising to vindicate him even in the distant future."
Yeah, it's supposed to be it's the same word as the avenger of blood, right?
Goel Dam, the Redeemer appears a lot in the Bible. He appears in Ruth, and he appears in Leviticus, I believe. Yeah, it appears a lot, and it has several meanings depending on the context.
His bones would not be subject to decay.
That's long. "I keep the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad and my soul rejoices. My body also rests secure. For you do not give me up to Sheol, or let your faithful one see the pit. You show me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. In your right hand are pleasures forevermore.
Thank you for that reading of Psalm 16, 8 through 11.
Yeah.
Either way, it
Pleasures
seems like
Is
a
forevermore.
very,
that a
very.
prophecy?
Well, we're all talking at once. It seems like a very bodily protection. Yeah, for you do not give me up to Sheol, or let your faithful one see the pit. So words for the underworld.
Mhm.
So it makes sense that his body is secure there. But again, not dealing with a prophecy, we're dealing with a psalm.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is David, as we've mentioned, goes through several struggles, runs away, is betrayed, has all kinds of things. And then in the end, he wins. And this is just the very natural, you saved me. I didn't die. I've been restored to my power. Huzzah. Again, if he had died, he would be rotting in a tomb because that's what you do. But he didn't, at least in that particular skirmish. So, yeah, heavy copium.
So, the traditional rabbinic understanding of this psalm is that this refers to the life that the righteous person, or David, will get in the world to come. For example, Talmud Bava Batra 17a reads, "The sages taught there were 7 people over whom the worm and the maggot had no sway, and they are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, and Benjamin, son of Jacob." And some say that even David is included, as it is written, "My flesh also dwells secure," in verse 9. And Yoma 87a reads, "What is the reason that whoever accumulates merit for the public will not have sin come to his hand? It is so that he will not be in Gehenna while his students are in the Garden of Eden. As it is stated, for you will not abandon my soul to the netherworld, neither will you suffer your godly one to see the pit." And Rashi comments, "My heart is rejoiced because I am confident that you will not forsake my soul to the grave, since, concerning the iniquity of a grave transaction which I committed, you sent me tidings. Certainly from now on you will not forsake me to turn from you." And Ibn Ezra writes, "David's soul will rejoice because it clinges to a power that is most high. The power to which David clinges will protect him from illness when things turn in the future. David's body will therefore dwell in safety in this world." End quote. Chacham, in volume 1, page 98, wrote that the psalm is alluding to both this world and the world to come. He writes, quote, "Cleaving to God protects a person for mishap in this world, and since it is stronger than death, it protects the pious man from being handed over to the underworld, and enables him to merit the eternal pleasures of beholding God's countenance." End quote. He notes that other rabbis considered similar views in Talmud Berachot 17a, Judah Halevi in Kuzari 1:109, and Maimonides in Guide 351. He further writes, "According to this interpretation, this psalm is one of the passages in the Bible that mention the hope of an afterlife. Following this approach, some say that the designation, the holy that are in the land, alludes to idols, which, according to those who served them, dwelt in the underworld. The idol worshippers would offer them sacrifices and libations so that the idols would later benefit them after they died and ascend to the netherworld. The psalmist says that he who serves the Lord does not need these things, for God will serve him from the hand of the underworld." End quote.
So is this is not a prophecy? Just want to be real clear. This is not a prophecy, not talking about Jesus.
Not even a little. This is someone who was afraid for their life and made it through and was grateful to God and a little hyperbolic about how happy they were about it. Or possibly not. I don't know.
Which takes us to the last one he mentions.
Oh, by the way, Psalm 22:16 says his hands and feet will be pierced. Okay, just so you know, in all of human history, talk to any atheist historian, they'll confirm this. In all of human history, there is only one method of execution ever that pierces hands and feet, and that's crucifixion. Okay? And so in Psalm 22:16, it was predicted that the Messiah would have his hands and feet pierced. Here's the only problem. Psalm 22:16 was written about 1000 BC, Any atheist historian will tell you that. Crucifixion wasn't invented until 300 to 400 BC. So this was written 600 to 700 years before crucifixion was even invented.
I've got a handful of questions about that. And first of all, Prometheus Bound, that was like 450 BC. We've got this guy tied to a rock, descriptively spread eagle. That's crucifixion, right?
And you have the corpse of Inanna nailed up in the underworld. You have all kinds of things. But the real problem is that hands and feet pierced is not exactly what it actually says.
Oh yeah, we should look at that. So in the version that I've been reading up to now, which was the new revised standard version, updated edition, in that one it says, "For dogs are all around me, a company of evildoers encircles me, they bound my hands and feet." But of course, there are several other translations that use the word pierce instead.
And again, the language here, as I understand it, and I would really like to hear Tamara and Lorence on here in more detail. I'll just give a quick overview. The language here is about a lion biting at hands and feet. That is the understanding that I believe is more believed to be more original to the text. And that, you know, if there's an issue of interpretation, is it pierced or bitten? And you're looking at that, well, look at the context. As Christians like, context. Literally, bulls of Bashan encircle and surround me. Bulls have horns that pierce. Mountain in the mountains, the roaring lions tear their prey and open their mouths against me, in verses 12 and 13 of Psalm 22. Everything is set up to say, I feel like prey, I am being attacked, even if quite obviously metaphorical, the lions and tigers and bulls, oh my, are my enemies. Still, it's all within that metaphor. And that's, you know, I can count all my bones, people stare and gloat over me, you know, running away into the mountains. You know, part of the time he lives, he's probably having trouble feeding himself. This is all in line with that, his running away and being afraid for his life and fighting for his life in the wilderness while hiding from enemies. This is David. This is all David. And the suffering of that. And, you know, yeah, maybe some metaphorical language in there, but bound hands and feet and being bitten by lions is not special. It's.
So you mentioned the corpse of, what was it, Inanna?
Inanna, yes.
Yeah, being nailed up by the hands or feet.
I haven't actually looked at precisely what bits they nailed more recently. The digital Hammurabi would be the best people to ask for that, because they can actually read the original.
Well, it sounds suspicious to me. I mean, like, tying people up is just like I would have thought like the most classic form of torture, right? So sure, there would be, but I guess crucifixion has to be something specific about the distribution of the body weight.
Well, not even that. This is how it probably would have actually looked. I can send you a picture of this later, Aaron, in case you need that. But as you can see, so the picture there with the actual bone and the wood, that's the actual, that's an actual archaeological remain. And then on the other side is the depiction of what Roman crucifixion would have looked like. So they put nails through your ankles, but then they tie your arms because there was no damage. It says here, the arm bones of the man show no signs of scarring from nails in the hands or above the wrists. It would appear, therefore, that the man was tied to the crossbar rather than nailed. So,
and that
was the standard practice. They would nail the feet, but not the hands.
Right. Yeah.
Very standard. And because again, one, don't waste nails. But the point of death by crucifixion is that by hanging your entire weight there and being unable to continually sustain yourself, you will slowly suffocate. It's awful. But putting the weight on nails on hands is not actually that, it's not going to be that effective. You can have tearing and it's just not useful.
Okay. But I guess the more important message here is not only that, being bound like this, or that even being crucified is not necessarily the way that this guy describes, but it's also not talking about piercing the hands and feet. It's talking about being hunted down by dogs and being bitten, and that this isn't about Jesus, nor even about Israel, as I understand. Some other translation was this supposed to be about? I forget. Maybe I'm confusing it with another alleged prophecy.
I think you're thinking of Isaiah. That's mostly the suffering servant Israel, whereas the Psalm is probably more
there
about
you go.
David. Yeah.
That's what I was thinking of. So again, not a prophecy at all. The people who wrote it did not intend for this to be prophetic. Yes?
Yes.
Right, definitely not.
Okay. I wonder because there's 100 prophecies, and the guy went through the list of, I don't know, a dozen or so of, I'm guessing, his favorite ones. And there was one that you started, there was one or two maybe that were actually meant to be prophetic, but didn't have anything to do with Jesus. We're talking about something else. And that's the best they've got.
Yeah. And we should think that they're talking about nails piercing hands and feet when it says literally in verse 21, rescue me from the mouth of lions, save me from the horns of the wild oxen, which either of which, I don't know if you've looked at them, can definitely pierce you in anything they get a hold of, really.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, this has been like the longest video of this series, but I'm glad that you guys were able to help me get into this and explore each one of these references to find out how vacuous they all are. So,
It's been delightful to join. Thank you for having me.